Spirit would come and touch my lips and let our hearts be receptive. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, it's always delightful to be in church, after the last year and a half when we've been gone almost all the time, and being back 2 weeks in a row now is really, really spectacular. It's fun. So, and I wanted to talk a little bit today about God's ways. And I wanted to start with Isaiah 55, verse 9. It says, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." A lot of times we think we know everything, and we think we know what God's will is. But one of the things that I've learned through life is that he always is so much further ahead of us. It's not even worth thinking about it. So it's probably better just to listen to his will. And, I started really as a youngster in the church listening to the mission stories. And it had a huge impact on me because the missionary doctors seemed like such wonderful people, traveling all over the world, great personal sacrifice, bring not only spiritual healing, but mental and physical healing. And I said, that's the most noble thing a person can do. So I decided when I was 8 years old that I was going to be a missionary doctor. And that was my dream until I was 13. At which time, having grown up in dire poverty, I decided I'd rather be rich. So at that point, missionary doctor was out and psychiatrist was in. Now, I didn't know any psychiatrists. Have you ever noticed on TV how they seem like rich people? They drive Jaguars and they live in the fancy mansions and they have these big plush offices. And all they have to do is talk to crazy people all day. It seemed like I was doing that anyway. So I said, this is going to work out extremely well. And my brother, bought me a subscription for Psychology Today because he knew I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And I was always reading this stuff about behavioral modification and all these things. And I was actually becoming a little psychiatrist. Everybody brought me their problems, I would sit down and stroke my chin, say, "Tell me about your mama." But I was really getting into this stuff, And I majored in psychology in college, went to Yale, and had incredible professors like Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud. And, I was really getting into all this psychoanalysis and stuff. It was really cool. But when I got to medical school, I started meeting a bunch of psychiatrists. Need I say more? But actually, some of my best friends are psychiatrists. But what I discovered is what psychiatrists do in real life and what they do on television are two completely different things. What they do in real life is much more important than what they do on television. But it really wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I believe that God gives everybody special gifts and talents. And so I stopped. I said, "Lord, what special gifts have you given me?" I started just going back through my life. And I realized he'd given me a lot of eye-hand coordination and the ability to think in 3 dimensions. And I was a very careful person. I never knocked things over and said, "Oops." It's a good characteristic for a brain surgeon, by the way. So, and I love to dissect things. And I put it all together and I said, "You should be a brain surgeon." And a lot of people thought that was a strange thing. At that time, there had only been 8 black neurosurgeons in the world. And so they thought that was strange. But I'll tell you something about the good Lord. When he gives you talent to do something, he doesn't care what you look like. Okay. All of us are beautiful to him. And we are all made in the image of God. And I'll tell you, when I take someone to the operating room and I open their head up, and I can't tell by looking at that brain what color they are. I can't tell where they came from in the world because that is really the thing that makes you who you are. Your brain does. It's not your skin or your hair or your nose or any of those things. It's the brain. And that's the mechanism through which God is able to communicate with us. And if we keep that in mind, it really gives us a certain perspective. And when we have perspective, we become closer to God in that sense. Well, I started as an adult neurosurgeon. I quickly learned that, no matter how good an operation you did on those chronic back pain patients, they never got any better until they got their settlement. Whereas with the kids, what you see is what you get. When they feel good, they feel good. When they feel bad, they feel bad. There's none of these secondary agendas. And also, you can operate on a kid for 10, 15, 20 hours. And if you're successful, the reward may be 50, 60, 70, 80 years of life. Whereas with an old geezer, you spend all that time operating, and they die in 5 years or something else. So I like to get a big return on my investment. I'm just kidding. I like old people. I'm one of them now. But you would have thought it was probably pretty unlikely that I would realize my dream because, life was very difficult. My parents got divorced early on. And, my mother was one of 24 children, got married at age 13. And they moved to Detroit. And she discovered years later that my father was a bigamist. And she only had a third grade education. She had to raise us. But she understood the importance of education. And, she was so insistent that we get a good education. And I was a terrible student. We were desperately poor. There was never money for anything. But she was just always pushing education. And, I was just the opposite. I was probably the worst student you've ever seen. All the other students loved the fact that I was in the classroom because I was the safety net. You never had to worry about getting the lowest mark on a test as long as I was there. And, I just didn't really pay attention. I didn't think I was smart, so why pay attention? I was in the back telling jokes and shooting paper wads and doing anything. And I remember once we were having an argument on the playground about who was the dumbest kid in the school. It wasn't a big argument because they all agreed it was me, but then someone tried to extend the argument to who was the dumbest person in the world. And I said, wait a minute. I said, there are billions of people in the world. And they said, yep, and you're the dumbest one. And that day, unfortunately, we had a math quiz, and I had a basic philosophical disagreement with the math teacher who thought you should know your timetables. And I said, since they're printed on the back of the notebooks, you could just look it up when you needed it. But you couldn't look at it during the test. So unfortunately, that day you had to pass your test to the person behind you. They would correct it as the teacher called out the correct answers. And then they give it back to you. The teacher would call your name out loud. You had to report your score out loud. Not a problem if you got 100 or 95. A major problem if, like me, you got a 0 and just had an argument about who was the dumbest person in the world. And I knew they were going to laugh hysterically, and I just said, what I'll do is I'll mumble when the teacher calls my name. She'll think I said something. The girl behind me will think I said something else. So when she called my name, I said, She said, 9? Benjamin, you got 9 right? This is wonderful. I knew you could do it if you just applied yourself. Class, this is a banner day. Benjamin has got 9 right. It was fun. She was just beside herself. The girl behind me couldn't take it any longer. She stood up and said, he said none. Well, the kids were rolling in the aisles, and if I could have disappeared in thin air, never to be heard from again in the history of the world, I would gladly have done so. But I couldn't. So I had to sit there and act like it didn't bother me. But it did. It bothered me a lot. Not enough to make me study, but it bothered me a lot. And, the kind of student that I was, unfortunately, reminds me of a lot of people that I see today. Not just students, but adults too, who don't know very much. And that is a major problem in our society today. People who don't know much are very easy to manipulate. And that's not the reason that God gave us these incredible brains. Well, my mother just didn't know what to do, so she prayed. And see, that's the wonderful thing about God. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. You just have to have faith. She had faith that somehow, if she prayed earnestly, God would give her the answer to how to get her sons to develop themselves intellectually. And he gave her the wisdom. In her opinion, my brother and I didn't think it was wise at all. I mean, making us turning off the TV and read books and submit book reports which she couldn't read. But, it had a profound effect, particularly as I started reading about people in lots of different professions. And I began to understand a very important concept. And that was that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. And one of the stories that had the most profound effect on me was the story of Joseph, sold into slavery by his own brothers. He didn't say, bummer, my brothers sold me into slavery. He said, if I'm going to be a slave, I'll be the best slave there is. He ends up overseeing Potiphar's household, captain of the Egyptian guard. And he does a spectacular job. And then Potiphar's wife sees him and tries to seduce him, but he is a man of principle. And as a result of that, he gets thrown into jail because she tells a lie on him. Now, obviously, Potiphar didn't believe the lie. He would have had him executed. But he had to save face for his wife. So anyway, he ends up in the jail. He says, if I'm going to be a prisoner, even though I'm living up to all the standards and principles that God has given me, I'll be the best prisoner there is. He ends up with a very responsible position in the prison, starts interpreting dreams, and ends up as the governor of Egypt, the most powerful nation in the world at that time. And you know what that said to me? It says it doesn't matter where you come from. What matters is whether you are willing to turn your life over to God. Because he can see far further than we can. And we look at situations and we look at circumstances and we say, oh, this is terrible. Oh, why is this happening? But he's working so many steps further ahead. If we could see all of that, we would never be fearful of anything. But we can't. So what we have to do is simply trust in him. Well, because I was doing all that reading, my grades zoomed. Within a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to laugh and call me dummy. Now they were coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But just what I actually experienced was a change in attitude. Isn't that what God wants us to do? He wants us to abandon the spirit of failure. And he wants us to adopt the spirit of victory, which comes through associating ourselves with him and trusting that he will lead in the right direction. Even when it looks grim, just knowing that. I remember as a freshman at Yale, I remember going off to Yale, I thought I was the smartest person in the world. And if not, at least in the top 5. But it wasn't long before I was feeling exactly the opposite. I was doing terribly. I was really ill-prepared coming from an inner-city high school in Detroit, going to a high-powered Ivy League school, and thinking that I could get away with the same stuff that I did in high school, waiting to the tests and then studying. So there we were, into that first semester, I was failing freshman chemistry. I mean, I wasn't even close to passing. It was so bad. And the professor, who was either very kind or very sadistic, I'm not sure which, he said, anybody who's failing, I will give you double credit on your final. Just so you could have that last little hope before you went down. And so the night before the final exam, I was sitting there. I said, Lord, I always thought you wanted me to be a doctor. And yet, if I fail chemistry, I'm not getting into medical school. So I'm not going to be a doctor. So would you please indicate to me what it is you really want me to do? Or, alternatively and preferably, work a miracle. And I picked up that big, thick chemistry book. I was going to learn all that stuff that night. And of course, I fell asleep. And I dreamed I was in an auditorium just by myself, and there was a nebulous figure working out chemistry problems. And I awakened early that morning. It was so vivid in my mind. I looked up all the stuff that I had dreamed about. And when I went to take the test the next day, it was all the stuff that was on the test. And so I aced the test and got double credit on it, and it all worked out beautifully. But I knew something that day. I said, Lord, that's not something that you normally do. You obviously want me to be a doctor. You obviously have a plan for me. And that gave me a lot of confidence going forward. I did change the way I did things, and so that he would never have to do that for me again. But by the time I got to medical school, it was really kind of a different experience for me. And after the first set of comprehensive exams, on which I did very poorly, I was sent to see my counselor. He looked at my record. He said, you seem like an intelligent young man. I bet there are a lot of things you could do outside of medicine. And he encouraged me to drop out of medical school. He says, you're not cut out to be a doctor, and we can help you get into another discipline. Can you imagine how devastating that was? Since I was 8 years old, I wanted to be a doctor. I finally get to medical school. It looks like the last hurdle. And now the person that the university chooses to help you get through tells you to drop out. And I went back to my apartment. I just prayed, and I said, Lord, is this what it's come down to? I don't see how I get out of this. But then I started thinking, inspired by him, of course, what kind of courses do you always do well in? And there were courses where I did a lot of reading, just read a lot. What kind of courses do you struggle in? There were courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures, because I don't get anything out of boring lectures. Nothing, zero. And there I was listening to 6 to 8 hours worth of boring lectures every day. So I made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. And the rest of medical school was a snap after that. And I remember going back to my medical school years later as the commencement speaker, and I was looking for that counselor, because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be a counselor. Because some people are just negative all the time. They can always think of bad things to say and why this is wrong and this, but they never seem to invest any time in actually figuring out the problem. That's a problem. Now, interestingly enough, a few months ago, I was back at my medical school. I was talking to the dean and some other people, and they told me that they've changed the whole curriculum now so that people like me don't have to go to class, and they can get all this stuff and written out for them so they can read it, so that people, in other words, they've changed the curriculum so that you can work according to your strength. And everybody learns in different ways. And if you can play to that strength, obviously they're going to learn much better, a lot faster. There are a lot of lessons in there, because even in our elementary schools, junior highs and high school, people learn differently. And if we learn how to take advantage of that, I think we're going to have a lot of people doing a whole lot better than they are right now. Something to think about. Well, at any rate, I fast forward a few years, and I find myself director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins at age 33. Most people haven't even finished their residency by that time. And I'm thinking that I'm pretty hot stuff. And this little boy comes along from Georgia. At age 2, he was a prodigy. He was already saying Bible verses. But at age 4, he started stumbling, couldn't walk, double vision, having all kinds of neurological problems. He was diagnosed with a malignant tumor of the brainstem, an inoperable tumor. They saw many specialists. Everybody told him the same thing: take him home, keep him comfortable, and let him die. And they ended up at Johns Hopkins. I remember seeing that boy for the first time on that stretcher, barely moving, barely breathing, secretions running out of his mouth, eyes crossed. I was thinking, what am I supposed to do? And I looked at the CAT scans, and there was this ugly brainstem tumor. And the parents said, "Doctor, we were directed here by the Lord because we would find a Christian neurosurgeon who could help our son." Amen. And I said, "But he has a malignant, inoperable brainstem tumor. There's nothing I or anyone can do about that." And they said, "Doctor, the Lord sent us here, and he's going to save our son, and he's going to use you to do it." I said, "Well, that's interesting." I said, MRIs are brand new. I said, let's do an MRI. Maybe it'll show something the CAT scan doesn't show. So we did an MRI. I had all the neuroradiologists look at it. They all said the same thing: malignant brainstem tumor, inoperable. I came back. I told the parents, and I said, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing to be done." And they said, "But doctor, the Lord is going to heal our son. And he's going to use you to do it." I said, "Look, once in 1,000 times the scans are wrong. And it's possible that it could be a fungal infection that has created a big inflammatory reaction, and it just looks like a malignant brainstem tumor, so I'll take a biopsy." They said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." I took him to the operating room, opened his head up, went down to the brainstem, ugly grayish red mass, took a frozen section, biopsy, came back, high-grade glioma, a very malignant tumor. I took out as much as I dared, closed them up, went out and talked to the parents. I said, "I'm sorry, but it looks like it is what we thought. And, only the Lord knows the beginning from the end. Only God can see beyond what we can see. Maybe your son has already served his purpose. We'll understand it better by and by." All the nice things we tell people. And they said, "Thank you, doctor. But the Lord is going to heal our son." And as I walked away, I was thinking, I've never seen people with this kind of faith before. Fully expecting that boy to deteriorate and die. But instead, over the next few days, his eyes started looking in the same direction. He started handling secretions. I said, "What's going on?" I said, "Let's do another scan." And we did, and there was still a big, ugly tumor. But there was a little ribbon of tissue way off to the side. And I said, "Is it possible that maybe this thing is outside of the brainstem and had just pushed the brainstem out of the way so no one could see it and smashed it?" And I said, "Maybe we should go back in." And the parents said, "By all means." And I went back in, and under the microscope, the nature of the tumor had changed. And as I peeled it away layer by layer, I got to the last layer, and there was the glistening white brainstem, smashed, displaced, but intact. Long story short, that boy walked out of the hospital and today is a minister. And, one of the oncologists involved in that came to me and he said, "Ben, I've always been an atheist, but I'm a believer now." But it wasn't really for him. It was for me. Because, you see, I thought I was doing all this stuff. I said, you came out of the inner city of Detroit, got a scholarship to Yale, University of Michigan, went to Johns Hopkins. You became the youngest director of a major division in the history. You are a bad dude. That's what I was thinking, okay? But after that case, I realized it wasn't me. I realized that it was him. And I said, Lord, from now on, you be the neurosurgeon. I'll be the hands. And that's where the term gifted hands came from. I realized that it was a gift from him. And once I recognized that, that's when all these amazing things began to happen. You know, not too many months ago, Candy was approached by a beautiful young woman. She came up and she said, "Are you Dr. Carson's wife?" And she said, "Yes." She said, "You know, he operated on me while I was still in my mother's womb." And it was a case of intrauterine surgery because there were twins. And one of them had severe hydrocephalus. The head was expanding so quickly, it was going to put the mother into premature labor, and they both would have been lost because their lungs weren't mature enough. And one of the obstetricians came to me and he said, because I had already started developing a reputation for doing unusual things, and he said, "Could you operate on that baby while it was still in the mother's womb? Really for the purpose of saving the normal baby?" And I was aware of a neurosurgeon who had been doing some experimental surgery on sheep in Philadelphia, so I contacted him. I said, "Bob, you think we could modify what you're doing and make it work on humans?" And we quickly figured out a way to do it. And we did the surgery, and you could see on the ultrasound the baby's head shrink right on the screen. And that bought several weeks so that the lungs could mature, and then the babies could be born. And it was a big national story. I remember my brother called me up. He said, "I just saw you on the evening news." But there was a firestorm of criticism. People were saying, we're not able to do that kind of surgery. That's unethical. There had been an article in the New England Journal of Medicine saying, intrauterine surgery, we're just not ready to do that. And shouldn't be experimenting with that. But then it became clear that not only was the normal baby okay, but the hydrocephalic baby was okay. And then all the critics were saying, well, I would have done that too under those circumstances. People always jump on the bandwagon when success is there. But, it was one thing after another. All kinds of amazing things began to happen. But one of the things that really strikes me, in 1997, I was asked to come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate type 2 vertical twins, joined at the top of the head, facing in opposite directions. There had been 13 attempts to separate twins like that before, none of which had been successful. And I knew it was going to be a great medical challenge, but it was also going to be a great social challenge because it was going to be done at the Medical University of South Africa at Madunsa, the only major black teaching hospital, always the stepchild throughout the apartheid period and the post-apartheid period. This was going to be their chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cape Town, Johannesburg, all the other great universities. I wasn't ready for all that social pressure. I said, "Lord, greater people than me have tried and failed. You're going to have to show me something here." And as I was studying their anatomy on our 3D workbench, this is a computerized system that takes the angiograms, the CAT scans, the MRIs, integrates them into a 3D image that you can see right in front of you. You put your goggles on, you can study the vessels, you can isolate a vessel, blow it up, go inside of it, like fantastic voyage. And as I was studying the drainage system, I realized that the common drainage system that they shared was narrower centrally than it was peripherally. And the traditional neurosurgical literature said, if you encounter a case like this, what you should do is decide which twin to give the drainage system to, and you separate them with 3 or 4 operations divided in time by several weeks to months so that they could develop alternative or collateral circulation. But I felt impressed that you could do it in one operation if you concentrated on the area where the vessels were narrowing down, because there would be a proclivity for new vessels to pop up in that area. And I explained it to the team, and they said, "You're the boss." And it was 2 days before New Year's of '98. Big sign over the OR, "God bless Joseph and Luca Banda." And they were having a song service and prayer service. And I was thrilled. And I said, "Can we bring in a stereo system?" Because I love inspirational music. 19 hours into the surgery, we were only 3/4 of the way finished. The part that remained was so complex, the blood vessels were engorged, adhesed, entangled. It looked impossible. And we stopped the operation. And I suggested maybe we could cover the area over with skin. And when we came back, they would have developed enough collateral or alternative circulation that we could cut through. And the doctors from Zambia, where the twins were from, in South Africa, said it's a great idea. And I know it would work at Johns Hopkins. But we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. And now I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't have all my fancy equipment that I had at Hopkins. I had my loops, and my scalpel, and a prayer on my lips. And I said, "Lord, it's up to you." And I went in there and started cutting between those vessels that were so thin you could see the anesthetic bubbles coursing through them, just daring you to make a mistake. I remember the first set of twins we separated, 60 units of blood. The second set, 80 units of blood. And I was thinking, there's not enough blood in South Africa if we get into these vessels. And then I kind of went blank. I don't remember what I did for the next several hours. And, the other neurosurgeons who were there later on told me, "We couldn't believe what you were doing." But when I made the final cut that separated those twins, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah Chorus. And everybody had goosebumps. And when we finished the operation, after 28 hours, one of the twins popped his eyes open, reached up for the endotracheal tube. By the time we got to the ICU, the other one did the same thing. Within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 3 days, they were eating. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling. And last year, they graduated from high school. But that was not the success. The success you had to be there to witness was the reaction of the people who were literally dancing in the streets, because this was done in their country, in their hospital. Their level of self-esteem was through the roof. And isn't that what real success is? Utilizing the gifts that God has given you to elevate other people. That's what it's all about. And, when I think about all kinds of things, you get confused. What is the right direction to go in? Who should you talk to? But what I always do is I said, "Lord, lead me. Show me the direction that you want me to go in." And it was interesting because there was a presidential debate this week on Thursday. Some of you probably saw it. And you notice how the tone was much better. And I was talking to Donald Trump afterwards, and he said, I was getting ready to really say some stuff. And then I remembered what you told me. And he said, "I'm not going to do it." Because I told him about acting presidential and how that was very important. When I think about Joseph and how God placed him in a certain place for a particular purpose, the Pharaoh was not necessarily the kind of person that you would probably want to sit down and have dinner with. However, because he had trust in Joseph, Egypt was saved, and the rest of the world was saved from a horrible famine. And the Lord has amazing ways that he does things. And it's much more complex than anything we can do. And that's why I always go back to Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It says, Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not to your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Thank you.